Good afternoon. My name is Robin Jaffe, and I am teaching this ongoing course called Mindfulness and Dharma at Home. I'm an experienced Buddhist practitioner, and I have been meditating for close to 40 years. I have studied and practiced in both the Theravada and Vajrayana traditions, and I will be teaching from my experience. I am not a scholar. I am teaching out of compassion in the hope that I can be of some benefit to others. My late Theravada teacher, Ayakema, wrote a wonderful book titled When the Iron Eagle Flies, Buddhism for the West. The title of the book was taken from a prophecy of the Indian sage Padmasambhava, who lived and practiced in the 8th century. He travelled to Tibet to help establish Buddhism there. His prophecy was, when the iron eagle flies and horses run on wheels, the Tibetan people will be scattered over the earth and the Dharma will go to the land of the red man. The land of the red man is considered to be the West. We can see how this ancient prophecy has actually come to pass. Horsepower and on wheels and iron eagle planes are an intrinsic part of today's society. When Tibet was taken over by China in the late 50s, many Tibetan teachers left Tibet and are now literally scattered over the earth. In the past 50 years, Buddhist teachers have also left their jungle monasteries in Burma, Thailand, and Sri Lanka, and have re-established their traditions in the West, where we have been fortunate to have been able to hear the Dharma and practice it, and to receive great benefit from doing so. In the West, Buddhism has flourished. 3 extraordinary Westerners adventured into Tibet in the early 1900s and shared their experiences with the West, opening the door in the West to Buddhist practices. Today's talk will be on Alexandra David Neel. The British novelist Lawrence Durrell called Alexandra David Neel the most astonishing Frenchwoman of our time. She was born in France in 1868, and she was a true free spirit. At the age of 15, she ran away from home and was on her way to England on her own, but had to return because she ran out of money. At 18, she ran away again and rode her bike through Europe, unaccompanied. She was a feminist and an anarchist, and at the age of 19, she moved to London, where she began studies with the Theosophical Society and a group known as the Supreme Gnosis. In 1889, she announced that she was a Buddhist. Influenced by meeting a Swami at the Theosophical Society, in 1891 she travelled to India and studied with the Brahmin yoga master Bhashakarandana for a year. Her father insisted that she trained in something. At that time, women could go to university and study, but they were not granted degrees. She studied at the Sorbonne and then trained as an opera singer, and she was quite talented musically. She had some success as an opera singer for a number of years. In 1904, she married Philip Neel, a wealthy engineer. David Neel insisted on living an independent life. She found the constraints of marriage to be too bourgeois for her. They separated shortly after the marriage, but remained devoted to each other for 37 years, until Neel's death in 1941. It was thought that he had financed her extensive travels, and he had agreed to her travelling, but had thought that she would be away for just 1 year. And as it turned out, she was away for 14 years, which of course caused some friction between them. David Neel actually had a personal inheritance and mostly funded her own travel. Neel helped her manage her inheritance, and he was also her literary agent. Over a number of years, she wrote 30 books on Buddhist studies, philosophy, and her extensive travels. Her most notable books were My Journey into Lhasa, 1927, Magic and Mystery in Tibet, 1929, and Initiations and Initiates in Tibet, 1931. And some of these books are still considered important Buddhist texts even to this day. Her teachings influenced the beat writers Allen Ginsberg and Jack Kerouac, and the advocates of Eastern philosophy Alan Watts and Ram Dass. From 1906 to 1911, she studied Buddhist philosophy and Sanskrit and Tibetan languages in London. During this time, she met D.T. Suzuki. In 1911, David Neel travelled to India again, where she started working as a journalist. In 1912, she met and befriended Maharaj Kumar Sidkyong, Tulku Namgyal, the Crown Prince of Sikkim. They both recognized they had a very strong karmic connection, and she later said that he was the great love of her life. Sidkyong had been educated at Oxford University and found David Neel to be highly intelligent and very knowledgeable about Buddhist philosophy. Unfortunately, he was assassinated after just 5 months on the throne. Sidkyong had wanted to reform Buddhism in Sikkim and had asked David Neel for her advice. When she returned to Sikkim in 1913, she was received like an official figure with a guard of honor. He gave her a set of female Lama robes, and there's a photograph of her wearing the robes. He had confided to her that his father wanted him to abdicate in favor of his half-brother. Sidkyong organized for Lama Kazi Dawa Sandup to accompany David Neel on a secret trip as a guide, interpreter, and professor of Tibetan on a trek high into the mountains to 5,000 meters. From the high pass, she looked onto the land of Tibet with a great yearning. Sidkyong was also present in 1912 when David Neel became the first Western woman to meet with and interview the 13th Dalai Lama. His Holiness told her that if she intended to progress in her Buddhist studies, she would need to learn Tibetan. He also implied that because of her advanced progress in meditation over just a few short years, that this inclination was due to past lives. She told him that she was the only Buddhist in Paris. This meeting inspired a quest to live and practice in Tibet that totally absorbed David Neel for the next 13 years. Her goal was to become the first Western woman to reach Lhasa, the Tibetan capital and the home of the Potala Palace, and the center of Tibetan Buddhist teachings. At that time, foreigners were forbidden entry to Tibet via India. This directive came from the Dalai Lama himself, who was greatly concerned that access to Tibet by Westerners would weaken Tibetan Buddhism. In 1912, David Neel went to Lachin in Sikkim, where she met and became a student of Lama Gomchen Rinpoche. He was a hermit, an ascetic, and a magician. She practiced and studied in a cave at 4,000 meters for several years, learning the technique of Tumo meditation, where the energy is used to create heat in the body. She was given the spiritual name by him, Yeshe Tome, which means lamp of Sages, which was important as she was now known by Asian authorities wherever she went in Asia. She traveled to many monasteries in Tibet to help improve her Tibetan. In 1914, David Neel met a 15-year-old Tibetan monk named Upher Yongden, whom she would employ as a servant and then later adopt as her son. He also became later on a lama. They travelled together for many years and co-authored a number of books together. Yongden wrote The Power of Nothingness in 1954 and Mipam, the Lamp of the Five Wisdoms. In 1916, they entered Tibet without permission. She met the Panchen Lama, who introduced her to his entourage, his professors, and even to his mother. She also received from him the honorary title of Lama and a doctor in Tibetan Buddhism. The British were very upset about this, as she had entered Tibet illegally, and as a result, David Neel was forced to leave Tibet. But because of World War I, she was unable to return to Europe. David Neel and Yongden travelled to India, Japan, Korea, to Beijing and China. Then they crossed China from east to west. They travelled for a number of years, crossing the Gobi Desert in Mongolia. They travelled with very few possessions. David Neel always carried a journal, a camera, and a pistol. During that trip, they faced many dangers and hardships, including robbers, and at one point they almost starved to death after a huge snowstorm blocked their progress. They were without food for 6 days. When they finally, again illegally, arrived in Tibet, they then spent 3 years at Kumbun Monastery, where David Neel translated the Prajnaparamita Sutra, also known as the Heart Sutra, with assistance from Yongden. In 1924, David Neel and Yongden finally entered the Forbidden City, Lhasa, after disguising themselves as poor pilgrims. David Neel dyed her hair black with Indian ink and covered her face with soot. She never met the Dalai Lama or saw the treasures of the Potala Palace, but she said that this was because she was in disguise and did not want to reveal herself to the authorities. They were discovered, though, by the locals to be impostors because David Neel liked to bathe every day in the river. They were reported to the governor of Lhasa, but had already left before he informed the British authorities. They then went to Gyantse, where they stayed for 2 weeks with the family of David MacDonald, the British sales representative. They turned up on his doorstep, exhausted, penniless, and dressed in rags. The family found David Neel to be very difficult and extremely stubborn, but she got on very well with MacDonald. In 1925, David Neel and Yongden returned to Europe, and stories of her adventures were in all the papers and magazines. Her books describing mystical Tibetan practices of levitation and tumo were met with some disbelief. In 1928, David Neel bought a house in Provence, calling it Samten Zong, or Fortress of Meditation. It was said to be the first hermitage and Lamaya shrine in France. She continued to write of her travels and wrote her most famous book, Magicians and Mystics in Tibet, there. She also gave lectures on Buddhist philosophy. At the age of 69, David Neel and Yongden went on another trip to China, which lasted 1.5 years. They then returned to Tibet and completed a 5-year retreat. During this time, she received the news that her husband had passed away in 1941 and was deeply saddened by this. After returning to France in 1946, she continued to write and publish books. But sadly, in 1955, she suddenly lost Yongden to kidney failure. He had been upset that She had treated him more like a servant than her son, and he felt that he wasn't acknowledged enough for his contribution to her books. He was highly intelligent, but had started drinking, which contributed to his early death. David Neel was now 87 and alone. She had expressed a wish to die under the stars in her heart home, the land of Tibet. When she was 100 years and 6 months old, she applied for a passport to travel to Tibet, which was approved, but she never made it. Sadly, on September the 8th in 1969, Alexandra David Neel passed away at the great age of 101 in Monaco. On the day of her death, she commented that strangely, she could feel her death coming. She had been cared for by a young woman named Marie Madeleine Perronnet for 10 years. They had a relationship that was a combination of mother-daughter, guru-disciple. The ashes of David Neel and those of Yongden were scattered into the Ganges River by Perronnet. The 14th Dalai Lama visited her home Samten Dzong and made blessings for her great contribution to Buddhism in the West. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope to see you again soon.